Hello everyone, and welcome. Today we will be breaking down Chief Butler Outis in her entirety to find out exactly how good she really is. There are a ton of different attributes to think about when determining whether an ID is good or not: clashing power, defenses, and most importantly, how well they fit in their respective team compositions. To start, let's go over the simple basics that determine whether an identity is usable outside of its team comp: clashing power and defenses. Otis's clashing power is pretty standard: 11, 16, and 16 in ascending order, all of which can be buffed to 13, 19, and 20. Her defenses are more on the frail side, not unreasonably so, but still weaker than normal with a -3 defense level. She is weak to pierce damage, which can be pretty scary considering pierce enemies usually have pretty nasty skills, but she resists blunt, which is the far more common damage type, and still probably the best to resist. All of her defenses, though, don't really matter since she has an evade, the most broken defense skill in the game and the only good one. Of course, evades are balanced by requiring sanity to be useful, but Otis has some unique sanity mechanics that make her evade usable earlier than anyone else's. She has the normal sanity gain of 10 plus 20% for winning a clash, as well as the extra 10 for defeating high-level units, but she also has an effect where she gains 8 sanity if she wins a clash against an enemy with lower sanity. This also works in reverse, where she loses 4 if she loses the clash, but that's so low that it doesn't really make a difference. On top of that, if you activate her passive, she will also gain an extra 10 sanity for winning a clash without losing a single coin. This basically means she can gain 28 sanity in a single turn. If she does not have max sanity at the end of turn 2, you're doing something wrong. Going further into her passive, it also gives her a bonus clash power and 20% damage to enemies with less than 0 SP, and if they have echoes of the manor, which we will talk about in just a moment, another 30% damage. This means she can gain an extra 50% damage for simply existing in a sinking team, though that's only for human fights. Most focus encounters don't have any SP, so you'd only be getting the 30% from echoes. She also gains 3 offense level for activating the previously mentioned sanity condition while at max HP. This gives some benefit to winning clashes outside of simply negating damage, and makes your subsequent clashing even easier to win. Since we're on passives, we might as well talk about her support passive. It gives an extra clash power to the ally with the most SP when they clash against someone with -25 SP. This is a very conditional effect, and outside of sinking units, it usually will only activate when you're already winning the fight. The most notable users of this outside of sinking units would be Dawn and Faust, as both their fluid sac ego is capable of lowering the enemy's sanity enough to activate the passive. Now let's move on to the main point of the ID: her actual usability in a sinking team. Before we can discuss whether or not she's a good sinking unit, we must first discuss what the actual point of a sinking team is, and that can be broken down into 2 distinct categories. First is when fighting enemies with sanity. The main goal of a sinking team here is to keep the enemy perpetually stuck at -45 sanity long enough for Spicebush Yisong to Sinking Deluge and insta-kill them. Now this only really applies to boss enemies who don't have a cleanse mechanic and also have sanity. If there is no boss or they have a cleanse, sinking as a status effect doesn't work no matter how good the identities actually are. In regular human fights, you'll just kill them before they even have a chance to reach -45, so it really only works on enemies with a ton of health. The second and more optimal way to use sinking is in focus encounters against gloom-weak enemies in order to finish the fight in 2 to 4 turns. In this regard, the status becomes nearly identical to Rupture, but is better as you do bonus damage. In any focus encounter where the enemy is not weak to Gloom, Rupture is, and always will be, superior. So what exactly makes a good sinking identity? Neutral sinking count application and moderate to good potency application. Looking at Otis, we can see her skill 1 has 2 sinking potency, which is not a very good start. Most sinking IDs have sinking count on their skill 1, with the few others having a mix, equivalent to about 4. Depending on how many coins an enemy has, you might be better off just using the evade to inflict 3 or 4 potency instead. This also has the benefit of not eating 2 count from the stack. Her skill 2 is a lot better, having 5 sinking potency and 2 count on Clash Win. While the count application is not neutral and is reliant on Clash Win, it is the best sinking application for any ID's skill 2. With it being a Gloom skill, it also is the one you'll want to be using the most, as since you'll be bringing her against Gloom weak enemies, it's just free bonus damage. Her skill 3 is where things become interesting. Up until now, she has been relatively okay, crazy amounts of sanity generation, and pretty good sinking application. Her skill 3 only has 3 sinking count on Clash Win, which on its own would be absolutely horrendous, but it does inflict 3 Echoes of the Manor next turn. So what is Echoes of the Manor, and is it any good? First of all, it is good to note that it applies not to the specific part that Otis is attacking, and instead applies to the enemy as a whole. I don't know when they made this a thing, but it's good that certain statuses now affect the entire enemy instead of just a specific part. The first and most important part of Echoes is that it has a 50% chance to inflict an extra sinking count whenever sinking potency or count is applied. This is a very powerful effect, but due to its RNG nature and with how most skills only apply once or twice, it is not something you should plan your whole strategy around. You'll definitely want to have it, but it's more of a nice side dish rather than the main course. That is, and probably always will be, Rhymeshank plus Sinking Deluge. The second aspect of the status is that it will change the enemy's panic type to Echoes of the Manor, which inflicts 2 of the status onto 2 random enemies whenever they panic. This sounds good, but is ultimately pointless. There are 2 main reasons this does basically nothing. First, since this only works against enemies with sanity, it won't do anything in most focus encounters. Most enemies with sanity are not capable of taking too many hits, and with how spread out damage is during human fights, it's very unlikely that they will panic before they just straight up die. Second, most boss enemies with sanity are not going to be affected by this, as they will likely be immune to its effects, resulting in this aspect of the status doing nothing. And lastly, an enemy without sanity, or those who are immune to the previous effect, will have a minus 10% chance to roll heads. For abnormalities, this means they have a 40% chance to roll heads, and for enemies with sanity, it means they could potentially have a 0% chance, which is pretty cool. Overall, it's a good status. Despite its RNG nature, it still works often enough to warrant being a good addition to any sinking team. This identity doesn't really fuel any of its egos, nor do they really benefit the identity at all. Ebony Stem is good because it's AoE, but does absolutely nothing outside of that. Holiday is decent for sanity healing and bonus damage, most useful if you can get it to activate on Gloom, though it is reliant on moving fast. Sunshower would be the best ego if the sinking count wasn't reliant on critting, and Yasunyata is okay for the corrosion for agility and less damage up passive for her skill 3. Of all her egos, Yasunyata and her base ego are the best simply for their passives. The only ego which really matters for sinking teams is, of course, Rhodion's Rhymeshank, which she partially fuels, giving Gloom with her skill 2 and defense. Now that we've fully dissected Chief Butler Outis and what she is capable of, I have come up with what I believe is the best and most optimal sinking team. The main team is the standard Spicebush E song for Sinking Deluge, Boatworks Ishmael for her insanely good sinking application on her skill 3, Daichi Rhodion for Rhymeshank, and I guess her skill 3 is pretty decent too, Daichi Honglu because his skill 1 is stupid, and finally Butler Outis. There is no good 6th sinking ID at the moment. The best you can do is Sunshower Heathcliff or Mariachi Sinclair, but both of them are mediocre at best. In just a few days, Family Heir Gregor will be the 6th unit. Even if his application turns out to be terrible, he would still be the best since his skill 1 is Envy, and with Rhodion being the only other unit with an Envy skill, it's necessary to fuel Rhymeshank. Support passives don't really matter and have very little impact overall. If there was one that did something super significant, I would mention it, but there really isn't. So just do whatever you want. All around, I would give this identity 7 butlers out of 10. Pretty good, but ultimately won't really change anything about how syncing works. Anyways, that's basically it. Goodbye.